Welcome back to the Fourth Way Podcast. For today's episode, I'm going to be reading an article by Harry Emerson Fosdick entitled The Unknown Soldier. And I thought it would really be a fitting episode as we round out this season, and especially as we look forward to, in the U.S. here, Memorial Day coming up on Monday in just a few days. So I think this is an extremely fitting article. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end when I provide some comments. But before I do that, just to tell you a little bit about Fosdick, he was writing at a time when fundamentalist Christianity was kind of coming on the scene with great power, and he was at the liberal end of the spectrum. And he was kind of fighting against this fundamentalism that was coming up. One of the things that I find interesting is, as I realize that I grew up in fundamentalism, and I'm still in conservative evangelical Christianity. And as I've worked through nonviolence and social justice and all those sorts of things, it's it's something that I find myself more and more struggling to maintain myself within conservative evangelical Christianity. There's a lot of the theology that I agree with, but the application that I just find absolutely abhorrent. And it's crazy because, somebody like Fosdick and a lot of the other, especially more modern pacifist writers from like the 1800s on, even maybe a little bit earlier, like 1700s on, a lot of them are Unitarian, Universalist. I would disagree with, with a lot of their like liberal theology, dismissing the Trinity at times. Some of these people, or the deity of Jesus, like those, I have really big problems with. Yet at the same time, I find that I feel much more of a kinship with these extremely liberal Christians. Even though I disagree with some of their really important core theology, I have more of a kinship with them than I do with my conservative evangelical Christians who have such a big difficulty with. And that's something that I've really struggled through. What does that mean? Does that mean that really can you have bad theology and good practice? Or does the good practice legitimate bad theology, and maybe it's my theology that's bad? Or is it possible to, have good theology yet bad practice? How does that work out? Because it seems like right thinking would produce right results. So if you see the people who have good fruit, what does that mean about what they're thinking? And that's why, for me, the early church is so important, because it really isn't until you get to the 1900s where it seems like you have what I would consider theology that I disagree with, that seems to somehow produce good results. Because the early church fathers, like, they believed in the divinity of Jesus. They believed in the Trinity, in the miracles in the Bible, all of those things, and they had good fruit, right? So even though I read people like Fosdick and some of the others that I've read here, like Balu and things, who might have a more liberal theology, I still maintain to a relatively conservative theology, and that is because that's grounded in some of the much older writings of the early church. But that's something that if you are coming out of fundamentalism, or you are still in conservative Christianity, that's something that you really have to struggle with, because a lot of the voices that you're going to hear from modernity are going to be voices whose theology is significantly different. And that reminds me also of a quote I've mentioned several times from Dietrich Bonhoeffer in one of his prison letters, where he's like, man, I feel like when I am around Christians, I can't even talk about God because it just feels like gross. Like, because what kind of Christianity are these, quote, Christians espousing? It's gross. He says, but like sometimes when I'm around non-Christians, when I'm around atheists, he's like, I feel like I can actually talk a little bit about God, because because I have more of a kinship with these non-Christians, these people who are openly non-Christian. And that's how I feel a lot of times. Like, you've got this cultural Christianity, you've got this Christendom, where sure, people espouse a certain theology with their mouths, but it's, dead branches, dead fruit, no fruit, bad fruit, all of those things. And that's a big struggle. So hopefully if you're kind of going through the same sort of thing, you can work through that. And I would encourage you to go deeper than the 1800s. I'd encourage you to go much earlier. Ante-Nicene is a great place to go. Not that they're perfect, but you've got a very broad range of theologies that go along with the practice of Christian nonviolence. So sorry for that long introduction, but hopefully that helps some people out. All right, without further ado, let's get into the unknown soldier. It was an interesting idea to deposit the body of an unrecognized soldier in the national memorial of the greatest war, and yet, when one stops to think of it, how strange it is. Yesterday, in Rome, Paris, London, Washington, and how many capitals beside, the most stirring military pageantry, decked with flags and exultant with music, centered about the bodies of unknown soldiers. That is strange. So this is the outcome of Western civilization, which for nearly 2,000 years has worshipped Christ, and in which democracy and science have had their widest opportunity, that the whole nation pauses, its acclamations rise, its colorful pageantry centers, its patriotic oratory flourishes around the unrecognizable body of the soldier blown to bits on the battlefield. That is strange. It was the warlords themselves who picked him out as the symbol of war. So be it. As a symbol of war, we accept him from their hands. You may not say that I, being a Christian minister, did not know him. I knew him well. From the north of Scotland, where they planted the sea with mines, to the trenches of France, I lived with him and his fellows. British, Australian, New Zealander, French, American. The places where he fought, from Ypres through the Somme battlefield to the southern trenches, I saw while he still was there. I lived with him in his dugouts in the trenches and on destroyers searching for submarines off the shores of France. Short of actual battle, from training camp to hospital, from the fleet to no man's land, I, a Christian minister, saw the war. Moreover, I, a Christian minister, participated in it. I too was persuaded that it was a war to end war. I too was a gullible fool, and thought that modern war could somehow make the world safe for democracy. They sent men like me to explain to the army the high meanings of war, and by every argument we could command to strengthen their morale. I wonder if I ever spoke to the unknown soldier. One night, in a ruined barn behind the lines, I spoke at sunset to a company of hand grenadiers who were going out that night to raid the German trenches. They told me that, on the average, no more than half a company came back from a raid, and I, a minister of Christ, tried to nerve them for their suicidal and murderous endeavor. I wonder if the unknown soldier was in the barn that night. Once, in a dugout, which in other days had been a French wine cellar, I bade Godspeed at 2 a.m. to a detail of men going out on patrol in no man's land. They were a fine company of American boys, fresh from home. I recall that, huddled in the dark, underground chamber, they sang, "Lead kindly, light, amid the encircling gloom, lead thou me on. The night is dark and I am far from home, lead thou me on." Then, with my admonitions in their ears, they went down from the second to the first-line trenches, and so out to no man's land. I wonder if the unknown soldier was in that dugout. You here this morning may listen to the rest of the sermon or not, as you please. It makes much less difference to me than usual what you do or think. I have an account to settle in this pulpit today between my soul and the unknown soldier. He is not so utterly unknown as we sometimes think. Of one thing we can be certain: he was sound of mind and body. We made sure of that. All primitive gods who demanded bloody sacrifices on their altars insisted that the animals should be of the best, without mar or hurt. Turn to the Old Testament and you find it written there, Whether male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before Jehovah. The God of war still maintains the old demand. These men to be sacrificed upon his altars were sound and strong. Once there might have been guessing about that. Not now. Now we have medical science which tests the prospective soldier's body. Now we have psychiatry which tests his mind. We use them both to make sure that these sacrifices for the God of war were without blemish. Of all insane and suicidal procedures, can you imagine anything madder than this? That all the nations should pick out their best, use their scientific skill to make certain that they are the best, and then in one mighty holocaust offer 10 million of them on the battlefields of one war. I have an account to settle between my soul and the unknown soldier. I deceived him. I deceived myself first, unwittingly, and then I deceived him, assuring him that good consequence could come out of that. As a matter of hard-headed, biological fact, what good can come out of that? Mad civilization, you cannot sacrifice on bloody altars the best of your breed and expect anything to compensate for that loss. Of another thing we may be fairly sure concerning the unknown soldier, that he was a conscript. He may have been a volunteer, but on an actuarial average, he probably was a conscript. The long arm of the nation reached into his home, touched him on the shoulder, saying, "You must go to France and fight." If someone asks why in this land of the free conscription was used, the answer is, of course, that it was necessary if we were to win the war. Certainly it was. And that reveals something terrific about modern war. We cannot get soldiers, not enough of them, not the right kind of them, without forcing them. When a nation goes to war now, the entire nation must go. That means that the youth of the nation must be compelled, coerced, conscripted to fight. When you stand in Arlington before the tombs of the unknown soldier, on some occasion, let us say when the panoply of military glory decks it with music and color, are you thrilled? I am not. Not anymore. I see there a memorial of one of the saddest things in American history, from the continued repetition of which may God deliver us, the conscripted boy. He was a son, the hope of the family, and the nation coerced him. He was, perchance, a lover, and the deepest emotion of his life was not desire for military glory, or hatred of another country, or any other idiotic thing like that, but love of a girl, and hope of a home. He was, maybe, a husband and a father, and already by that slow and beautiful gradation which all fathers know, he had felt the deep ambitions of his heart being transferred from himself to his children, and the nation coerced him. I am not blaming him. He was conscripted. I am not blaming the nation. It never could have won the war without conscription. I am simply saying that is modern war, not by accident, but by necessity, and with every repetition that will be more and more the attribute of war. Last time they coerced our sons. Next time, of course, they will coerce our daughters. And in any future war, they will absolutely conscript all property. Old-fashioned Americans, born out of the long tradition of liberty, some of us have trouble with these new coercions used as shortcuts to get things done. But nothing else compares with this inevitable, universal, national conscription in time of war. Repeated once or twice more, it will end everything in this nation that remotely approaches liberty. If I blame anybody about this matter, it is men like myself who ought to have known better. We went out to the army and explained to these valiant men what a resplendent future they were preparing for their children by their heroic sacrifice. Oh, unknown soldier, however can I make that right with you? For sometimes I think I hear you asking me about it. Where is this great new era that the war was to create? Where is it? They blew out my eyes in the Argonne. Is it because of that now from Arlington I strain them vainly to see the great gains of the war? If I could see the prosperity, plenty, and peace of my children for which this mangled body was laid down. My friends, sometimes I do not want to believe in immortality. Sometimes I hope that the unknown soldier will never know. Many of you here knew these men better, you may think, than I knew them, and already you may be relieving my presentation of the case by another picture. Probably, you say, the unknown soldier enjoyed soldiering and had a thrilling time in France. The Great War, you say, was the most exciting episode of our time. Some of us found in it emotional release unknown before or since. We escaped from ourselves. We were carried out of ourselves. Multitudes were picked up from the dull routine, lifted out of the drudgery of common days with which they were infinitely bored, and plunged into an exciting adventure, which they remember yet as the most thrilling episode of their careers. Indeed, you say, how could martial music be so stirring and martial poetry so exultant if there were not at the heart of the war a lyric glory? Even in the churches you sing, "Onward, Christian soldiers, marching as to war." You, too, when you wish to express or arouse ardor and courage, use war's symbolism. The unknown soldier, sound in mind and body, yes. The unknown soldier, a conscript, probably. But be fair and add that the unknown soldier had a thrilling time in France. To be sure, he may have had. Listen to this from a wounded American after a battle. "We went over the parapet at 5 o'clock and I was not hit till 9. They were the greatest 4 hours of my life." Quite so, only let me talk to you a moment about that. That was the first time he went over the parapet. Anything risky, dangerous, tried for the first time, well handled, and now escaped from, is thrilling to an excitable and courageous soul. What about the second time, the third time, and the fourth? What about the dreadful times between? The long, drawn-out, monotonous, dreary, muddy barrenness of war, concerning which one who knows said, 9/10 of war is waiting. The trouble with much familiar talk about the lyric glory of war is that it comes from people who never saw any soldiers except the American troops, fresh, resilient, who had time to go over the parapet about once. You ought to have seen the hardening up camps of the armies which had been at the business since 1914. Did you ever see them? Did you look, as I have looked, into the faces of young men who had been over the top, wounded, hospitalized, hardened up, over the top, wounded, hospitalized, hardened up, 4 times, 5 times, 6 times? Never talk to a man who has seen that about the lyric glory of war. Where does all this talk about the glory of war come from anyway? "Charge, Chester, charge! On, Stanley, on!" were the last words of Merryman. That is Sir Walter Scott. Did he ever see war? Never. And how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temple of his gods? That is Macaulay. Did he ever see war? He was never near one. "Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. That is Tennyson. Did he ever see war? I should say not. There is where the glory of war comes from. We have heard very little about it from the real soldiers of this last war. We have had from them the appalling opposite. They say what George Washington said, "It is a plague of mankind." The glory of war comes from poets, preachers, orators, and the writers of martial music, statesmen preparing flowery proclamations for the people who dress up war for other men to fight. They do not go to the trenches. They do not go over the top again and again and again. Do you think that the unknown soldier would really believe in the lyric glory of war? I dare you. Go down to Arlington and tell him that now. Nevertheless, some may say that while war is a grim and murderous business with no glory in it in the end, and while the unknown soldier doubtless knew that well, we have the right in our imagination to make him the symbol of whatever was most idealistic and courageous in the men who went out to fight. Of course we have. Now let us do that. On the body of a French sergeant killed in battle was found a letter to his parents in which he said, "You know how I made the sacrifice of my life before leaving." So we think of our unknown soldier as an idealist, rising up in answer to a human call and making the sacrifice of his life before leaving. His country seemed to him like Christ himself, saying, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me." Far from appealing to his worst, the war brought out his best, his loyalty, his courage, his venturesomeness. his care for the downtrodden, his capacity for self-sacrifice. The noblest qualities of his young manhood were aroused. He went out of France a flaming patriot, and in secret quoted Rupert Brooke to his own soul. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There, you say, is the unknown soldier. Yes, indeed. Did you suppose I never had met him? I talked with him many a time. When the words that I would speak about war were blistering fury on my lips, and the encouragement I gave to war is a deep self-condemnation in my heart, it is of him that I think. For I watched the war lay its hands on these strongest, loveliest things in men, and use the noblest attributes of the human spirit for what ungodly deeds. Is there anything more infernal than this? To take the best that is in a man and use it to do what war does? This is the ultimate description of war. It is the prostitution of the noblest powers of the human soul to the most dastardly deeds, the most abysmal cruelties of which our human nature is capable. That is war. Granted, then, that the unknown soldier should be to us a symbol of everything most idealistic in a valiant warrior, I beg of you, be realistic, and follow through what war made the unknown soldier do with his idealism. Here is one eyewitness speaking. Last night at an officers' mess there was great laughter at the story of one of our men who had spent his last cartridge in defending an attack. "Hand me down your spade, Mike," he said, and as 6 Germans came one by one round the end of a traverse, he split each man's skull open with a deadly blow. The war made an unknown soldier do that with his idealism. "I can remember," says one infantry officer, "a pair of hands, nationality unknown, which protruded from the soaked ashen soil like the roots of a tree turned upside down. One hand seemed to be pointing at the sky with an accusing gesture. Floating on the surface of the flooded trench was the mask of a human face which had detached itself from the skull. War harnessed the idealism of the unknown soldier to that. Do I not have an account to settle between my soul and him? They sent men like me into the camps to awaken his idealism, to touch those secret, holy springs within him, so that with devotion, fidelity, loyalty, and self-sacrifice he might go out to war. O war, I hate you most of all for this, that you do lay your hands on the noblest elements in human character with which we might make a heaven on earth, and you use them to make a hell on earth instead. You take even our science, the fruit of our dedicated intelligence, by means of which we might build here the city of God, and using it, you fill the earth instead with new ways of slaughtering men. You take our loyalty, our unselfishness, with which we might make the earth beautiful, and using these, our finest qualities, you make death fall from the sky and burst up from the sea and hurtle from unseen ambuscades 60 miles away. You blast fathers in the trenches with gas while you are starving their children at home by blockades. And you so bedevil the world that 15 years after the armistice, we cannot be sure who won the war. So sunk in the same disaster are victors and vanquished alike. If war were fought simply with evil things like hate, it'd be bad enough. But when one sees the deeds of war done with the loveliest faculties of the human spirit, he looks into the very pit of hell. Suppose one thing more, that the unknown soldier was a Christian. Maybe he was not, but suppose he was, a Christian like Sergeant York, who at the beginning intended to take Jesus so seriously as to refuse to fight, but afterward, otherwise persuaded, made a real soldier. For these Christians do make soldiers. Religion is a force. When religious faith supports war, when, as in the Crusades, the priests of Christ cry, Deus vult, God wills it, and confirming ordinary motives, the dynamic of Christian devotion is added, then an incalculable resource of confidence and power is released. No wonder the War Department wants churches behind them. Suppose then that the unknown soldier was a Christian. I wonder what he thinks about war now. Practically all modern books about war emphasize the newness of it. New weapons, new horrors, new extensiveness. At times, however, it seems to me that still the worst thing about war are the ancient elements. In the Bible, we read terrible passages where the Hebrews thought they had the command from Jehovah to slaughter the Amalekites. both man and woman, infant and suckling, ox and sheep, camel and ass. Dreadful, we say, an ancient and appalling idea. Ancient? Appalling? Upon the contrary, that is war and always will be. A military order issued in our generation by an American general in the Philippines and publicly acknowledged by his council afterwards in military court commanded his soldiers to burn and kill, to exterminate all capable of bearing arms, and to make the island of Samar a howling wilderness. Moreover, his council acknowledged that he had specifically named the age of 10 with instructions to kill everyone over that. Far from launching into a denunciation of the American general, I am much more tempted to state his case for him. Why not? Cannot boys and girls of 11 fire a gun? Why not kill everything over 10? That is war, past, present, and future. All that our modern fashions have done is to make the necessity of slaughtering children not the comparatively simple and harmless matter of shooting some of them in Samar, one by one, but the wholesale destruction of children, starving them by millions, impoverishing them, spoiling the chances of unborn generations of them, as in the Great War. My friends, I am not trying to make you sentimental about this. I want you to be hard-headed. We can have this monstrous thing, or we have Christ, but we cannot have both. Oh, my country, stay out of war. Cooperate with the nations in every movement that has any hope for peace. Enter the World Court, support the League of Nations, contend undiscourageably for disarmament, but set your face steadfastly and forever against being drawn into another war. O Church of Christ, stay out of war. Withdraw from every alliance that maintains or encourages it. It was not a pacifist. It was Field Marshal Earl Haig who said, "It is the business of the churches to make my business impossible. And oh, my soul, stay out of war." At any rate, I will myself do the best I can to settle my account with the unknown soldier. I renounce war. I renounce war because of what it does to our own men. I have watched them coming gassed from the front-line trenches. I have seen the long, long hospital trains filled with their mutilated bodies. I have heard the cries of the crazed and the prayers of those who wanted to die and could not. And I remember the maimed and ruined men for whom the war is not yet over. I renounce war because of what it compels us to do to our enemies, bombing their mothers and villages, starving their children by blockades, laughing over our coffee cups about every damnable thing we have been able to do to them. I renounce war for its consequences, for the lies it lives on and propagates, for the undying hatreds it arouses, for the dictatorships it puts in the place of democracy, for the starvation that stalks after it. I renounce war, and never again, directly or indirectly, will I sanction or support another. O unknown soldier, in penitent reparation, I make you that pledge. And that is a powerful piece. And I'm sorry if it's a bit disjointed. I actually had to stop it a lot at various places because my voice just couldn't keep doing it. It brought me to tears. And I think that's why I wanted to select this piece as the one that is here to coincide with Memorial Day. Because I think one of the things that I struggle with is, I've got very good friends who are soldiers. I'm sure all of us in the United States at least have relatives who are soldiers. And a lot of times I have this feeling of guilt. Like, I think war is a terrible thing. And I think that Christians should embrace nonviolence. But I also recognize that we have been conditioned by society, by parents, by schools, by all sorts of things, by our nation, by pastors, to value war. And so I understand why people are soldiers. I understand. And there's this really deep conflict within myself where I value these people and I value the values, which Fosdick kind of highlights throughout, right? These values of courage and honor and sacrifice. And I recognize that those things exist in these people. Yet at the same time, I recognize the horror and the sin and the evil of war and being willing to kill other people and all of that sort of thing. And so this piece is largely Fosdick, who is he's repenting to soldiers. So he's upholding nonviolence and pacifism, but he's doing it by honoring a soldier and saying that he was complicit in creating the unknown soldier. He was complicit in sending people off to war. And so it's a really just a beautiful thing where Fosdick is not being judgmental about individuals or soldiers per se, but he's judging himself and his own participation, and he's making a vow that he will not uphold such a system. And so I think it's just a beautiful balance of presenting the nonviolent case through the horrors of war and unmasking what war truly is, while at the same time doing it in a way that is honoring those who have been seduced into such a position of being a soldier and killing other people and all that sort of thing. So on Memorial Day, and in honor of Memorial Day, we really can, as pacifists, honor the lives of those lost. Not only the lives of our countrymen and women, but the lives of those our countrymen and women have killed. And we can recognize how people are drawn into those sorts of things and the just the sin and the deception in the human heart. And then we ourselves can repent of the ways that we have contributed to that. And we ourselves can vow, as Fosdick did, that we will not participate in that. So, as we look forward to Memorial Day and honoring human life, let's just unpack a few of the things that I think are especially valuable from this work here. First of all, there's this strand that I would say it reminds me very much of thinking back to my propaganda season and the one with McNamara's Folly and conscripting lower IQ individuals and practices of not conscription but recruitment. Right? I think of this idea of the war pigs. If you don't know that song, you should go look it up. But it's a great song, right? This song about war pigs. Like you've got these regular everyday soldiers who are seduced by propaganda, by, hey, we'll pay for your college, by, you're poor. Well, hey, guess what? The army will offer you a job. And they're seduced, a lot of people, by all of these sorts of things, getting to shoot big guns, getting to drive tanks, whatever it is. Like, there are lots of reasons to desire to join the U.S. military. But who's really running the military? Who's running this show? Who's benefiting from the propaganda? Well, the military-industrial complex, right? Fosdick identifies a number of people, right, where he says, like ministers, churches, politicians, poets, right? All of these people who are, and he cites a number of poets who write these fantastic poems about the glory of war. And he's like, they were never in war. And especially if you look at, there's plenty of World War I poetry, especially, where you've got guys who are just detailing the horrors of war. And if you go to YouTube, you can see the shell shock and all kinds of things that these guys are going through. If they were there for any extended time, a lot of them are not writing this lyric poetry that's just beautiful about war, but they're unmasking the horrors of it. I'm sure you've got psychopaths like Patton who write this like war horror stuff, like where greasing the treads of their tanks with the enemy intestines and stuff, right? And Patton, certainly he was in battle, but his battle was a lot different, which is what Fosdick is pointing out about a lot of these people. It's like, okay, maybe they went over the trenches once, but they weren't really face to face with it. They weren't really in danger of it. So there's a large element of propaganda that's in here from Fosdick, and he recognizes that he himself was used as a propagandist. Like, he was there, his job as a chaplain was essentially to get the guys to go out and fight, like to give them that little last bit of courage, to affirm that these ideals everybody was cramming down their throat were true, that their sacrifice was valuable, which was especially laughable in World War I. I mean, people just going over the trenches for no reason. And you could argue that maybe that was unique to World War I, and the sacrifice of life is more meaningful in some of these other wars, but still, like, by and large, it's just meaninglessness, which is what Fosdick is pointing out. I mean, the U.S. just got off fairly recently of a 20-year engagement in Afghanistan. For what? Nothing, right? Meaningless. So many of these wars are absolutely meaningless and just maybe inconsequential, but even if they are consequential, just so costly. Like, are they really worth it? But we have to believe that they are worth it. And we have to have things like Memorial Day and Veterans Day, which is just a load of propaganda. Again, if you go back to our season on propaganda, that we have a season for Veterans Day, which was actually used to be Armistice Day, right? Day of Peace, which before that was a religious feast for Saint Martin of Tours, who was a pacifist. Like, he laid down his sword and refused to fight because he said, God, I'm a Christian. I can't fight. And so we kind of we hijacked Martin of Tours' feast day, which is a day of peace, and we've turned it into Veterans Day. So reading this piece by Fosdick and just looking at the ways he describes propaganda, and then looking at how he views this as like a systemic sort of thing, right? He as a preacher, the institution of the church was a part of it. The institution of government, the institution of media, if you want to consider, like the poets and stuff, but certainly today, because Fosdick wrote this, I guess, like 15 years after World War I. So media as we know it, with as large as it is, wasn't quite as big. I know that Woodrow Wilson was using the papers and such quite a lot, and maybe radio back in World War I. But certainly today, Fosdick would include the media in this. And he gives you a great look at how the system is run. And so the big critique isn't of the individual soldier, even though the soldiers make individual choices. It's a critique of the system that runs the show and the systemic injustice. And sometimes people are like, well, yeah, but what can we do about that? Nothing. Like, you can't go and fix the system, but you can do what Fosdick does, right? You as an individual can make your choice, and you can step away from the system, and you can refuse participation with the system. And it's only when many individuals make that choice on an individual basis that all of a sudden change is affected. If you focus on affecting the whole system all at once, it doesn't work, and it kind of helps you to avoid culpability and responsibility, because you just throw up your hands and say, well, what can I do? It's like, well, you yourself choose to do the right thing. So Fosdick, I mean, there's so much going on here just in this regard, and propaganda and systemic injustice and all of that. You should grab this piece and mull it over, read it through a few times. One of the other aspects I really liked about this work was Fosdick fairly early on talked about the unblemished sacrifice of the youth. And it was beautiful imagery that he used, but terrible, right? And that's something I would strongly recommend. A piece by Stanley Hauerwas, I'll try to link it in the show notes. I think it's called The Sacrifice of War and the Sacrifice of Christ. And he kind of gets into the idea of war as sacrifice. And he even has not an anthology, but whatever, compilation of war writings that he has, writings on war. And I think it's included in that, but you might be able to find the article online too. I'll see if I can find that. But yeah, this idea of of soldiers as sacrifices and the religious language that comes around it is absolutely fascinating, but also horrifying when you recognize the way that our military system is essentially a religious institution. It's unnerving. Another thing that I thought was a bit interesting, he talks a little bit about conscription and freedoms. The position that he takes there on freedom, you'd think that almost that he was like a conservative, right? Not a liberal, because he's like, hey, they're going to do this, and then they're going to do that, and then they're going to do this. But he's recognizing that more and more freedoms will get taken away. And this is something interesting that it doesn't seem like it worked out that way. They did conscript for World War II, I believe, and Vietnam, but after that, there hasn't been conscription for like 50-ish years. I don't think, not that I can remember. Of course, we also haven't been in big wars. Sure, conscription would come back. I mean, 18-year-old boys, at least men, have to register here at the post office as able fighters or whatever. And I don't remember, but I know they were at least talking about making women do that too, or at least maybe making it optional. I don't know if anything ever passed, but they've at least been talking about adding women to the conscription queue. And so certainly they are talking about that in case they would ever need to draw from that. And surely, if we got into a huge war here in the U.S., surely they would start conscripting women. Like, I can't imagine that they wouldn't nowadays. So we haven't seen this come to fruition yet, but right, Fosdick, I think, was right here. And particularly interesting, he said that they're going to start conscripting our daughters. Like, he foresaw that. And in World War II, they didn't conscript women, but notice what happened. I don't know how much women joined the workforce in World War I and factories and things, but like World War II, there was a huge campaign to like get women to go out and support their country and work in the factories and stuff. There were lots of nurses and things too, who I know that there were women who were killed on the front line, maybe not front lines, but like on ships and things, wherever, in hospital stations. There were women killed in World War II who were in the army or whatnot, but there were lots and lots of women who started to join the endeavor, the war endeavor, in a more direct way in World War II. And so that's something interesting that Fosdick kind of predicted. One other just interesting thing, it's not huge, like ideological, but I did like that Fosdick referenced the Philippines, which I guess for him would have only happened a few decades earlier, like 1900-ish, where there was a massacre of Filipinos who were 10 and over. And so it's just something that most people don't know in the U.S. today. And again, we referenced that in our episode on Haiti in our propaganda season, just about the dehumanization that the army used, even for like they had this song, right? If you're a Christian and you grew up in evangelical Christianity, you probably know the song, "Jesus loves the little children, all the children of the world, red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight." Well, they used that same tune, and they had a terrible one in the Philippines, damn the Filipinos, cross-eyed kakiak ladrones, something, right? Civilize them with a Craig, essentially, like basically bayonet them. They've got this song that U.S. soldiers are singing while they're massacring Filipinos. And there's so much to U.S. history that is just kind of put to the side that nobody references, nobody knows about. And I like that Fosdick here references the Philippines. Finally, I want to hit on this last ideological aspect that Fosdick nails that I think is so important and is really helpful for me. But towards the end, the last third of the work, Fosdick talks about how, soldiers sacrifice, soldiers have honor, soldiers have courage, all of these things. And he talks about how the damnedest thing about war, the thing that makes it most like hell, isn't that there's hatred in war, isn't that there's terror and horrible things in war. He says that you have these lovely things that are conscripted for doing great evil. You have courage, which is a beautiful attribute that is utilized to massacre people. You have something like sacrifice, which is beautiful that you would lay down your life for somebody, but it's used for the military-industrial complex. You have just these absolutely beautiful attributes that are wielded for great evil. And that's what I think I find so difficult about a day like Memorial Day, when most of us in the United States know somebody, even if it's somewhat distant, but who served in Vietnam at least. We still have Vietnam soldiers who are alive, right, in Vietnam, or maybe like a grandpa or a great grandpa, somebody maybe you know of, who served in World War II. Maybe they were in D-Day or they were in the Battle of the Bulge or something, and like you can recognize those people and say, I really like those people. Like, they have values, they have things that I admire, and I know that they showed great courage, and I know that they risked their lives, and I know all of these things, these lovely attributes that they had or still have. And so when you get to a Memorial Day as a pacifist, to think about, like, I do recognize these beautiful, wonderful things, and I want to, yet at the same time, I don't like war. It's evil. It's hell. Like, you've got these two competing ideas in your mind. And what Fosdick does here is he's like, yes, soldiers display these beautiful, wonderful attributes. And that's what makes it so terrible, is that the propagandization of these attributes to turn them into something wicked and evil, to use it for those ends, that's what makes this so murky for a lot of people, and what makes it just so terrible that God's good could be wielded for such great evil. So an embrace of nonviolence is not failing to recognize the beautiful attributes that many soldiers have shown and continue to show. What pacifism and nonviolence is it's saying, hey, we need to take those attributes and we need to detach them from the systemic injustice, the systemic violence, and we need to use them to, as Fosdick said, create the city of God on earth, to work for shalom, to work for peace, to create the kingdom of God. Jesus brought it, and we're establishing it now. At least Christians in the church ought to be. But instead, so often, as Fosdick recognized, the church is actually the mouthpiece for the devil. The church is the mouthpiece for systemic injustice. It's the mouthpiece for the beast, for government. And how do we change that? We don't. You do. I do. As individuals, we make the choice to do what is right. So this Memorial Day, for those in the U.S., or for those worldwide, if you have your own Memorial Day, or if you want to celebrate with us, let us honor the dead, all dead, enemy, friends, our own nationality, whatever. Honor the human life that was lost in war, in terrible, horrible, evil war. Praise the beautiful attributes that soldiers have displayed, and refuse to condone the evil that is war. But I'll warn you, don't expect that people will understand that, because a propagandized society, as we saw in our season on propaganda, is a polarized society. They don't understand nuance. If you're not with them, you're for them. And so if you denounce war and what soldiers have done, while praising the attributes that soldiers have displayed and honoring the dead, including enemy dead, people won't get that. They won't understand that. And hopefully that sparks some questions and interest and with people, and you can have a discussion. But it's something that will not be accepted, will not be tolerated by a lot of people. It'll be viewed as unpatriotic. It'll be viewed as unloving. It'll be viewed as traitorous, whatever else. But if you are a Christian, our allegiance is to Christ alone, and Christ calls all humanity to himself, not just Americans. As I end this episode, I think back to my own complicity with promoting wars, with voting for any president, but especially, well, I guess my first vote was probably for George Bush II, and I know what he did with the power that I gave him. He started that 20-year-long war with Afghanistan, and all the stuff in Iraq and everything else, and I was a part of that fervor, longing for blood. You know, the country song, we'll stick a boot up your ass, it's the American way. You know, Uncle Sam put your name at the top of his list. How that old country song about, like, we're gonna go back and we're gonna kick some butt, we're gonna get some revenge. Like, I love that song. Right? I was a part of that war fever, and I was part of the mouthpiece of propaganda that encouraged my fellow man to go out and kill. And I'm a part of that. So with Fosdick, I want to end here. Oh, unknown soldier, I make you this pledge. I renounce war and never again will directly or indirectly sanction or support another. A huge thanks to Riverside Church for giving me permission to use this work by Reverend Fosdick. Please make sure you check out the link in the show notes, because there is a place that you can go to see a lot more of these works that have recently begun to be digitized. That's all for now. So peace, and because I'm a pacifist, when I say it, I mean it. This podcast is a part of the Kingdom Outpost Network. Please check out the links below to find other great podcasts and content related to nonviolence and kingdom living.